We are very excited to be moving into our second panel of the day, focusing on the hardest hit sectors. We've all heard throughout this pandemic that COVID 19 has had a disproportionate impact on different demographics, regions, and of course, sectors of the economy. Businesses had to pivot virtually overnight to operate with as little contact with their customers and each other as possible. For some businesses, this pivot was manageable and aspects were already in the pipeline. For others, and especially for those sectors who cannot replicate their services virtually, this was nearly impossible. These sectors are what many refer to as the hardest hit, those who were hit first, hit hardest, and will be the last to recover. We heard earlier this morning about the K-shaped recovery of our economy, and it is these sectors that are on the downward slope of that K. Arguably, these are also the sectors that are in most need of support from government just to survive this pandemic, let alone recover. As we approach the 1 year mark of COVID 19, we have gathered a panel of leaders from hardest hit sectors of travel, food services, and natural resources to discuss how the pandemic has impacted their business, how they have adapted, and importantly, what more needs to be done to help them survive and recover. Joining us for this important discussion is Tim McMillan, President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Jordan Holm, President of Boston Pizza, Michael Rousseau, CEO of Air Canada, and Deborah Flint, President and CEO of the Greater Toronto Airport Authority. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to offer our panelists the opportunity to make some opening remarks. We will begin with Tim from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Tim, go ahead.
Thanks, Alla. And maybe just a couple comments for context. For our industry, we thought 2020 was going to be the year of recovery, that we'd been losing capital investment for 5 years. In 2014, we were investing over $80 billion into the Canadian economy, and we'd lost investment each year. We thought 2020 was the turnaround year. Unfortunately, a few events all stacked up to make it incredibly challenging for us. One, we got blockades on our rail lines that drove differentials for oil early in the year. Then the COVID lockdowns globally started to drive the consumption off of its record levels. And Saudi Arabia and Russia took that as an opportunity to go after market share, and they started to flood the market. It was a comedy of errors. They underestimated the damage that would be done. And in fact, they drove prices into the negative, that Canadian oil was selling at negative prices. We were paying people to take it from us. The way our industry is set up, that you can't just turn it on and off. It had huge repercussions on the balance sheets of almost every company. When the lockdowns really started to take effect here in Canada, our first thoughts were, one, how do we continue to operate safely and ensure that natural gas is continuing to heat the homes across Canada and the power plants, that oil is getting to the refineries, and that, if we are going to be locked down for a period of time, that Canadians would have that security of energy. We also knew that it would have huge damage on the balance sheets and on liquidity availability for companies that rely on it. We spent a lot of time working with governments on both how we operate safely, on how we sustain ourselves through that period, and what it looks like coming out the other side. We saw over about a 3-week period, $10 billion worth of capital was canceled. Companies went into survival mode. We're a very resilient industry, and we have continued through. By midsummer, we actually saw global demand had come back to almost 90% of the record levels that it was at. Today, it's at about 95% of pre-COVID, which was record levels for oil and gas. And we have actually seen that prices have come back quite strongly, that today gas is over $3, oil is over $6, world prices. We have seen a lot of fallout on the mergers and acquisitions side, that damage is real. It's driving companies to look for efficiencies, and that often means that we're losing some companies and they're merging and being acquired. Going forward, I think we are one of the hardest hit sectors, but we're one that's committed to being part of the recovery. That today we're coming through the health crisis, but within months, the global demand for capital is going to be back in action, and Canada needs to be competing. That today we're competing for vaccine. A few months from now, it'll be competing for capital and jobs. And I think we're well poised to be part of that recovery when we see demand get up to record levels again. So I'll conclude my remarks there, but look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Next, we'll turn to Jordan from Boston Pizza.
All right. Thank you, Alla. And thank you to the Chambers for hosting today's event and to highlighting the need for business-led recovery, and particularly for having this panel, because as you mentioned in the K-shaped recovery, there are, just like there are different impacts on individual lives in Canada from the pandemic, there are different impacts on businesses and whole sectors of the Canadian economy that need to be considered differently. There's a representative group on this panel, including the Canadian food service industry. Maybe just a couple of comments about Boston Pizza first. Boston Pizza is Canada's largest full-service dining brand. We started in Edmonton in 1964. We have almost 400 restaurants nationally in all 10 provinces and 2 territories. And they're all except 5 are locally owned by independent franchisees. So we are a company that makes up a national footprint. It's very much local restaurant ownership. And so probably a good microcosm of what's going on in the overall food service industry. And so I'll speak more to that experience. And the Canadian food service industry has been described as a load-bearing pillar, both culturally and economically, in the lives of Canadians. And I'll touch on the cultural part first, because I think we've all been missing our valued and cherished occasions out in restaurants and other food service venues that have become a part of our lives. And in fact, when Canadians are surveyed, or have been surveyed over the last year about the things that they're most missing in their lives in a time of social isolation and staying home a whole lot. Number 1 is friends and family, which it should be. But number 2 is time out in restaurants. And it's a huge part of our recreation, part of our culture, part of our social lives, and places that bring family, friends, fans, teammates, neighbors all together. And we play a really important role in people's lives. And we want to get back to doing that. But we also play an enormous economic role in the Canadian economy. We are the 4th largest employer as an industry in Canada, with about 1.4 million direct jobs. There are a whole bunch of indirect contributions as well through our supply chain: farmers, food manufacturers, beverages, all kinds of services and suppliers that feed into this wonderful Canadian sector and industry that rely on us. And when we look at what the experience has been like for the food service industry over the last year, you know, we are an industry that comes from health and safety. We feed people in our restaurants every day, and that involves trust and involves consideration of health. And so we were very proactive as an industry, both in dealing with the initial signs of concern, proactively closing our dining rooms and sports bars in a lot of cases before we were required to do so, investing, some estimate, $750 million on everything from personal protective equipment, sanitization, social distancing, plexiglass, you name it. The industry has done everything to continue to operate safely, including continuing to provide off-premise takeout and delivery in all the regions where it's been deemed an essential service at a time when people are staying home and in need of food options. So, you know, as an industry, what we're looking for now is just a follow through on the commitment that we believe the leaders have made to business owners and operators across the country, that if asked directly to do something that has a financial impact and is done so to navigate our country through this pandemic, that the programs and support will be there for us. And there have been some good things. There have been some positive things like the wage subsidy program and others, but there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. 90% of restaurants in Canada right now are losing money, even with the programs in place. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the rest of this year is going to unfold. And that needs to be clarified for people. They need to know how these programs are going to be managed, and they need to know what additional support and changes can be brought so that we can see a return of the jobs, we can see a return of the investment that people have made in these businesses. So very much looking to both government support and ultimately welcoming back the consumers who want to be in our Canadian food service environment.
Thank you, Jordan. Next, we have Michael from Air Canada.
Right. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for attending. Let's start with some facts about Air Canada. In 2019, Air Canada had revenues of over $19 billion, was the 20th largest airline in the world, and had just won for the 8th year out of the last 10, the best airline in North America. In 2019, we served 221 markets around the world on 6 continents, connecting Canadians to the rest of the world. In 2019, we employed almost 40,000 hardworking and committed people. And in 2019, our Air Canada footprint contributed almost 2% by itself to Canadian GDP. Unfortunately, today, our annual revenue run rate is less than $4 billion, an 80% plus reduction in both revenue and passengers. Because of the numerous and complex travel restrictions we have, we now fly to approximately 50 markets, primarily domestic, and international flying now is focused primarily on cargo. As a result, we've had to reduce our employee base by 25,000 to roughly 15,000 currently. Still on a pro rata basis, much higher than the amount of flying that we're doing. All of this change in light of the fact that travel accounts for less than 2% of cases, and that we believe the risk can be mitigated by enhanced testing and enhanced protocols. We have had to make some incredibly difficult decisions and gut-wrenching decisions to reduce our cash burn, as we have a very high fixed cost structure, to reposition ourselves as a smaller airline to grow into the recovery, all in an environment where we have no visibility as to what we call an off-ramp strategy. Certainly from a policy perspective, we need 2 critical items. One is a clear, comprehensive off-ramp, as we call it, strategy from the Canadian government, working with key stakeholders that involves more appropriate testing, certainly before vaccines gain critical mass, however, probably afterwards as well. This strategy would see the gradual reduction of the quarantine period and other restrictions based on science and the studies we've collectively have developed over the past 10 months. And second, specifically for the airlines sector, we need sector financial support on reasonable terms and conditions, recognizing the large economic footprint we have. As we've recently commented on in public markets, we are in discussions with the Canadian government, and we are encouraged with the direction of this important file. To provide a little more detail as to how we've managed this situation so far, one, we entered the pandemic with a very strong balance sheet, brand, and market reputation. This allowed us to raise an incredible $6.8 billion in 2020 in new funding from the capital markets, both debt and equity. Unfortunately, due to our high fixed cost structure, continued investments in strategic initiatives, and debt and interest payments, we burnt $5.2 billion of that funding in 2020. At the end of the year, we had available cash of $8 billion, which was in fact $1.6 billion higher than the start of the year. Second, we had to make some very difficult decisions, as I mentioned before. The reduction of the 25,000 hard-working committed employees by far was most difficult. In addition, we downsized our fleet by early retiring a number of fleet types. We renegotiated virtually every major contract we had with our partners. We cut existing and future capital expenditures to the bare minimum to ensure that we remain competitive for the long term. On that front, we made conscious decisions to continue to fund key projects, which will improve our brand, especially from a customer perspective. We completed 2 very complex technology projects, the first being our passenger sales and service system, and the second is a complete relaunch of Aeroplan in November, certainly with much more customer-friendly benefits. In addition, we continue to invest in new planes like the Airbus 220 and now the MAX to offer a better customer experience, reduce our cost structure, and certainly lower the carbon footprint. However, I would say we are most proud of our leadership in the biosafety side. We were first adopters of temperature checks and requiring masks to be worn on planes. We worked with the GTAA especially and others to create a customer journey environment that was much more touchless and biosafe. We have learned a lot and we will continue to adapt on that front. We also worked with the GTAA and McMaster Labs on conducting the largest test of returning travelers in the world. We have provided all the data to the government to help them develop a go-forward policy. We're working with CDL and other leading companies to create a rapid test protocol for back to work and maybe even the traveling public in the near future. I know I'm probably coming up and exceeding my 3-minute time frame, however, I believe I've covered the key points. The last thing I want to leave you with is that we will rebuild Air Canada. It will take several years. However, we have the experience, we have the passion, and especially the strong culture of a can-do attitude that will get us back to where we were in 2019. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. And lastly, we'll turn to Deborah from the Greater Toronto Airport Authority.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Of course, I look forward to a day when I'm in this forum and we're talking about being part of the greatest hits and not the hardest hit club that we're in, and with my counterparts here on stage. First, let me take a moment to thank the frontline workers across all of Canada's airports for keeping goods and essential people moving during this pandemic. The way they mobilized in the early days and continue to stand strong and serve us and serve our country through goods movement, and their service at airports is really appreciated, and we should take a moment to commend them. 1 year ago, approximately, I joined the GTAA and was so excited to lead Pearson Airport. I was joining a championship team, and I was excited to take that team and Pearson and GTAA to new heights. We had a great foundation to build upon and an exciting vision for the future. We had many what I call championship rings. We are the airport that's in the center of the second largest employment hub in Canada. 400 companies do business at the airport with over 50,000 employees. We were the top 5 most connected airport in the world. Top 5 most connected airport in the world. And that's a very big currency for countries and for airports and for regions. And another big ring we had was that we're in the top 4 of the port of entries across the world into the United States. Those are incredible status points for airports and for countries to have. Modern cities know and understand the power that a strong aviation sector can bring. And countries around the world invest heavily in those aviation sectors because they know it's the key to their competitiveness. We have seen whole regions and new economies and centers of commerce develop because of investments in the aviation sector. But sadly, as I sit here today, those rings, they're not on our fingers anymore. And we must have a playbook to get those rings and those championship labels back once again. In an urgent manner, we must design the systems to protect health and also coexist with what is going to be a long runway on this virus. Even after we have achieved herd immunity, there is going to be a pandemic sensitivity in our future. I know that we can do it. Reflecting back, within 3 months of the virus being declared at Toronto Pearson, we anticipated, we designed, procured, partnered, Michael referred to that, with the Air Canada and others, and launched our Healthy Airport brand and transformation, an initiative that has been recognized globally and is award-winning. So we have the capability to do this. And we know that as we sit here today, that a restart plan and a playbook for aviation, it is essential. In today's environment, we already see that countries and airports are recognizing that it is going to be even more competitive to attract air service and the economic benefit that comes from that. And that's right here in 2021 and is going to be the state for the next several years. I see foreign airports already deploying more smart airport processes with intentionality on capturing a smaller market of internationally connecting passengers. And that was one of our prior rings. I'm concerned that we may stay still against that new champion, against those new competitors. As we approach the 1 year mark of the pandemic, I ponder, in hindsight, will 2021 be the year that Canadian aviation lost its competitiveness? It definitely does not have to be that way. Canada's airports, airlines are visionary and capable. And in partnering with government and bringing business forums to bear, we can develop a pathway that manages the virus, protects health, and also restarts the travel economy.
Thank you. Certainly, there's a lot to unpack amongst all of your opening remarks, and I think it's really interesting to see that even amongst the hardest hit sectors, there's different realities, different concerns, and different priorities that you all have. Deborah and Michael, picking up on what the two of you were talking about, and you both mentioned it a little bit in your opening remarks. Earlier this morning, we heard from a different panel that the air industry, the travel industry, is often highlighted as one of those that is in a critical straits that really needs some support. There's no doubt that the sector has been decimated during this pandemic. There's record lows in passenger numbers, as you both hinted at. The International Air Transport Association estimates that travel volumes will not return to pre-COVID levels until 2024 at the earliest. What do you think that is needed in the meantime to help your sector survive and have that restart plan that you mentioned, Deborah? Is it government financial support? Is it other initiatives? Maybe Michael, we can start with you.
Sure. I made these comments in my opening remarks. It's two. It's support for the transition period, but to Deborah's point as well, it's immediately trying to work together with the government of Canada to have a plan, a comprehensive plan to reintroduce travel safely into the market. And like Deborah, there are a lot of creative people around, and we know a lot more now after 8 months of testing, running different protocols, advancing science. And so I certainly, that's our call to action, and as to how to open up the economy, how to open up travel, and how to get Canadians to travel safely around the world.
Yeah, again, agree with that. We, Canadian airports in particular, we're borrowing from our future in order just to survive. Many of my colleagues across the country are trading survival today for tomorrow's opportunities. So financial relief is critical. The government has deferred our paying rent in 2021. So, we have to pay it in the future, and we're going to borrow away for that, no doubt. The other element is that, like Michael said, we have long seen that coexisting with the virus and in pandemic environment was going to have a very long runway for us. And so testing is such an important part. I'm already seeing that test. So I do think that there's a need to take testing and to deploy it in a national strategy and in a provincial strategy that has some harmony to it, and then to create testing and vaccination as use that to create a permission to travel or permission to do many things in society. So I think there is an important need for a digital comprehensive passport, if you will. Some people just call it digital permissions to travel or permissions to engage in other social activity based on vaccination, based on testing. And there's a lot of progress being made. There are countries that are ahead of us. Panama and Copa Airlines are deploying IATA's travel pass system to allow travel into that country and to continue to, I think Panama has a very strong reputation for being pro-economics and pro-business. And they're furthering that because in a few weeks, they're starting to use travel pass to allow business and the economy there to restart.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, one of the themes that we have in Canada during this pandemic is a patchwork of inconsistent restrictions and regulations all, you know, across Canada in different sectors. And we know that that makes it especially difficult for businesses to operate or plan. Um, you know, at the same time, a lot of these restrictions seem to be a reaction to case numbers on a daily basis. And there isn't always that science-based decision making happening. Jordan, I want to turn to you with this theme. You know, you mentioned that you have, Boston Pizza has, you know, over 400 establishments all across the country. How have these inconsistencies made it difficult for your franchisees to operate or for the corporation itself to plan when you have different rules in Ontario versus Alberta versus Nova Scotia at any given time?
Thanks, Alla. So it has been definitely challenging to keep up with all of the messages around health, be they federal, provincial, or municipal, and then the guidelines that change on a very regular basis in response to the regional health differences, let's call it. The fact is that Canadian business operators, I think, are perhaps far too accustomed to having to navigate an overly complex operating environment. And we can probably have another conference just to talk about that and the opportunities to streamline that overall. But because of that background, we're pretty good at adapting to the health regulations. We track it and communicate it through our system and through industry associations as well to help restaurants to understand not just how it's affecting them, but how it's affecting their guests and what messages are going out to them. I think the confusion and the differences, and as you said, not always tied to common, consistent science metrics. I think that's actually having a more profound effect on the public at large. And I think what we've learned over the last year is it's less what the rules are, but whether people follow them or not. And if people are confused and are pointing out all the inconsistencies and you know, are seeing the exceptions more than the rules, then that's how they're going to behave. And that's unfortunate because we need a consistent message, and we need people to do their part, just like the industries and restaurants have had to do our parts to navigate through this second wave and to get to a recovery in the near future.
Absolutely. And speaking of recovery, Tim, I want to pick up on what you said in your opening remarks, where you said, you know, the natural resources sector has been dealt with a lot of challenges over the years, and 2020 was supposed to be the year of recovery. And clearly a number of events, including the pandemic, made it so that that wasn't the case. But in the early stages of the pandemic, there were significant efforts that were made with moderate success to urge the federal government to launch a support package to guide the resource sector through the worst of the crisis. From your perspective, are there policies or actions that you think the federal government could or should introduce at this period in time? Or is it the case that the existing policies simply just need to be improved or tweaked?
No, absolutely, and great question. I think we look at it really in two. There's the crisis and working through the crisis, and then there's the recovery. And we have a foot in both camps. We were one of the hardest hit in the crisis, and we think we are one of the biggest opportunities Canada and the federal government and provincial governments have to spur on recovery. And I would say we're already at work trying to position ourselves for success. As Deborah noted, she asked the question, is this going to be the year that Canada loses its position as one of the top nations when it comes to airport hubs? For us, I would say that Canada lost its top position as investment opportunities for oil and gas in probably 2014. And we've been working very hard to recapture it. We have world-class resources. We have technology development in the oil and gas like none other, environmental standards that are world-class at a time that global demand continues to grow and set new records. So what we would look for the federal government is really enable our strongest resources to contribute to the recovery. And we have worked with the federal government for several years. And I think if not now, when would we reposition Canada? On manufacturing, we get 100% capital deductibility. For oil and gas, we don't. I think that's one obvious place to start. The Atlantic Canada tax credit was taken away a few years ago. We're losing out on capital projects to Norway, who's already moved post-pandemic to change their tax and royalty structure to reinvigorate some projects, while we continue to see Atlantic Canada not getting the new projects that we think it should have there. And maybe the last thing I'd note is we've also put forward to the federal government that we are world leading when it comes to environmental performance, regulations, standards, and targets. Now is a time for Canada to continue to lead in that regard, but let's not put any further barriers to investment in Canada. We should be the barrel of choice, but we need to be able to attract that investment. And we know what the government's carbon targets are, their Paris commitments. I don't know what their employment and investment targets are for the next 10 or 20 years. I think that it would be important to have clarity for investors globally. What's Canada's ultimate plan when it comes to investment in oil and gas and beyond?
Absolutely. And I want to turn to our audience questions. And Tim, your remarks will lead perfectly into one of our more top voted questions here. They state targeted support helps, but in the long run, a policy rethink is needed to ensure pro-competitive policies are established to result in growth and productivity, especially in the hardest hit sectors. Would you say you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. That when you look at the Canada's strengths, we should be able to compete with anyone in the world. We sometimes have to get out of our own way. And for our sector, which, as I say, we kind of have a foot in both camps when we're looking forward on the recovery side, getting the basics right is maybe job number one. Leveling the tax structures in Canada between manufacturing and oil and gas investment to attract investment would be key. And we're getting some infrastructure in place. It continues to be a challenge. Having a regulatory regime that allows new projects to develop our resources is something that I think, again, would be fundamental to the Canadian economy coming out of the crisis, but for the long term as well.
Absolutely. And I'll pose a question to the other panelists, whether you think a policy rethink is needed to encourage pro-competitiveness in Canada. Maybe Michael?
Sure. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is a period of uncertainty. It's a period of reflection. And so challenging the status quo is always a good thing to become more competitive in the future. And I know business leaders working with the government should take that on as an opportunity to relook at the way we conduct ourselves in the global environment and see how we can do better.
Perfect. And another question that we have here is specifically related to airports, but I think that it can travel, but I think that it actually has a broader implications. A question here says, what explains the inability to develop a comprehensive testing strategy when the good work conducted at Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto airports show low travel risk? And I think that can apply to a comprehensive testing strategy to other businesses, whether it's small businesses, whether it's food services and restaurants. Maybe Deborah, we'll start with you, just because the question was specifically targeted to airports.
I think that there is no inability to do that. We're absolutely capable of designing and implementing quite quickly a comprehensive strategy. One of the things that we've recognized in this pandemic is you can't wait to solve the full macro problem, right? You have to try to see around those corners and develop tools to be flexible and nimble. So let's start with something. That's what we did collectively in the test that we ran with McMaster and Air Canada last summer, which proved a lot. But if we hadn't done that, we might be sitting here today still wondering what the actual results were. So, again, in partnership, cross business, and then ultimately the government is now both at a provincial level and federal level began arrival testing. It's a straightforward tool in my perspective to begin to lay out that framework. We stand ready to work across business in partnership across the industry and with the government to make it happen.
Jordan, I want to turn to you. Are you concerned with the number of safety apps and QR code options that are currently in the market? There's a risk that people risk phone app fatigue. And is there a way to consolidate this down to make it clearer for companies and consumers?
Yeah, great question. And certainly the expectations around digital engagement with guests have been on the rise for a number of years. But certainly the health considerations and people wanting to interact digitally with menus or to pay their bill or even order through digital platforms using their own devices has increased. It's been something we've been investing in as a brand for a while at Boston Pizza. But certainly we do see a proliferation of QR codes and other support applications for other brands and single restaurant operators and so forth to try to navigate those waters. And they are coming at us fast and furiously because there is consumer need and really some health requirements in some cases to offer a digital menu and to allow your guests to touch as few things as they feel comfortable with in the restaurant environment. So could there be a streamlining? Absolutely. That would be a benefit. But we also know there's a lot of companies out there that are jockeying for a position in a part of our industry that is experiencing significant growth right now. And there are different needs at the restaurant level for what people want to invest in or that they can afford. All that to say, it's definitely an area of focus for our industry, and it'll be an over-indexing part of our digital platform focus in the months and years ahead as we go into what hopefully is the post-pandemic era and look to see how guests want to and feel most comfortable in the restaurant space.
Absolutely. Just turning back to, I have a couple more questions before we turn to a closing statement from you all. General question for all panelists. How has Canada's response or lack thereof for sector-specific support thus far compared to what other countries are doing in the G7 or even G20? And what would you like to see Canada do differently now? Maybe we'll start with Tim.
I think I might be looking back at the time where it was extremely challenging. I would say I would want to recognize that both federally and provincially, we had great interactions with political leaders that were earnestly concerned about the safety of workers and sustaining through that crisis period. For the federal government, I would want to recognize the site rehabilitation program moved over $1 billion to get service companies working and sustaining that equipment through the crisis and through the next couple of years. We did a lot of work with the federal government and the BDC and EDC on liquidity. That was much slower than maybe we had expected. But again, I want to say there were earnest efforts and ultimately funds have flowed, and it has been very helpful to help sustain some companies through that period. Damage is obviously going to be done, and there's going to be a lot of consolidation. We're already seeing that. But as we're kind of looking forward, I think that it is equally as important to be thinking about what comes next and how do we compete? Because as I said earlier, today we're competing for vaccines, and it is a country versus country approach by much of the world. And I can tell you that when it comes to attracting capital going forward, we need to be focused on that sooner rather than later. And I would say many countries are already trying to get one step ahead of their competitors. And I don't think Canada wants to be falling behind in that regard.
Absolutely. Michael, we'll turn to you for the same question and in terms of competitiveness that Tim was mentioning as well. How is Canada's response compared to for the airline sector compared to what other countries around the world have done over the pandemic?
I think my understanding is that IATA has published the fact that countries have provided upwards of $200 billion of support to their airline industry. And then if you look closer to us, south of the border, U.S. CARES Act has provided over $65 billion of support, both in payroll and low interest loans to the airline sector. And of course, many of those airlines south of the border do compete somewhat for traffic with Air Canada. Canada did put in some programs that were helpful. The LEAF program, which we looked at, but we didn't think applied, and we saw better opportunities in the capital market. And they certainly put in the CEWS program to help us support to employees. And we've certainly taken advantage of the CEWS program. But our discussion with the government has been more about something more specific to the airline industry. And as I said before, we're on that road, we're on that path, we're encouraged by that path, by the discussions we're having. You could argue it's a little bit late compared to everyone else, but the positive fact is that there's a path that we're encouraged that we're on right now to provide some level of sector support that would help us and the entire airline industry in Canada.
Yeah, and one could argue it's also better late than never, of course, in that regard. Deborah, what about you? What have you seen compared to what other countries around the world are doing for their airports?
Sure. Let me acknowledge, similarly encouraged about the government's fall announcement of supporting the sector and cheering for solutions with the airlines. We need healthy airlines across the whole sector for airports and all of the other employers that are related to that ecosystem to be successful and to recover as well. And I'm also appreciative of at the provincial level that we're in a position with arrival testing and Premier Ford's commitment and his support of using the science and the data from testing to reduce quarantine, which is a blanket on travel. Of course, all this being at the right time. I'm a bit envious of my colleagues and my peers and friends down in the United States and across the world as well. In the US, just yesterday, there was an announcement of a potential $9 billion additional grant package for airports alone. $9 billion. This is not the first tranche of that. There's been billions that have been extended. So, there's a marked difference in my view as a CEO versus my colleagues across the world who, I collaborate with, but I also compete with them as well. They're very optimistic. They're seizing the opportunity to double down on investment in infrastructure. My colleague at Seattle CTAC just announced a $340 million terminal expansion. The program that I started at LAX, $14 billion, is now being accelerated, not cut. I've had to cut the program here substantially at Pearson. But instead, LAX is accelerating. And those are real competitive forces and threats that we don't feel it right now, but I caution, we are going to feel the brunt of it. The reality of our contribution as an industry to GDP is longstanding, and it's not showing up today, but it is going to show up, and it is going to be a very detrimental position for us to be in. So I have to be positive and know that forums and discussions like this, the engagement that we're having with government, which shows more promise more than ever, will position us to be able to recover. But a sense of urgency, I can't impress enough how much that is needed.
Absolutely, and I'll leave it with Jordan for final comments on this question. I mean, how is Canada's response or lack thereof for sector-specific support compared to what other countries around the world are doing for the food services industry?
And thanks, Alla. So I guess I would just echo the comments from the rest of the panelists around timing, I believe, has been the most challenging issue. I think that everyone's operating in good faith and we have engagement. I believe there are commitments at a high level to help the sector with survival through the waves, but also with recovery further, when that opportunity presents itself, as it did for parts of the third quarter last year when we were able to reopen and welcome guests back in before the second wave began. I guess it is just that timing piece is that the Canada seems to be slower in actually rolling out the details of the programs, leaving people to face the first of every month when large rents are due and other considerations that have caused over 10% of our industry to permanently close already. We haven't recovered a lot of the jobs that were lost even from last spring. And that decision is being made in real time by restaurant owners and operators and their staff across the country. And without the details of the programs for survival and for recovery, it's really hard to make commitments and decisions without that. So I would just encourage, if we can improve the speed at which we follow through on the programs and get the details into people's hands so that they know what they're facing.
Thank you. I want to now turn to a closing question for all of the panelists. We've largely focused on the negative impacts of the pandemic and those impacts on your sectors. But I wondered in your closing comments, if you could identify one or two opportunities and potential points of strength coming out of this pandemic. What are they? What have you done as a benefit coming out of this? If you could address that in your closing comments, that would be great. Tim, we'll start with you.
Perfect. Well, thanks for pulling this panel together. I think a few times in history is this conversation going to be more important than right now. And the panelists that you have here, I look at them all as customers of the products that we produce, and also suppliers to our businesses that are producing them. It is so integrated here in Canada that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. I think that as we look for oil and gas going forward, that the demand for those products got hit in the spring. It went down 15% from pre-COVID levels. We saw it bounce back to almost 90% of pre-COVID levels by midsummer, and the International Energy Agency predicts that global demand for both oil and gas will reach record levels and continue to grow as early as 2023. Canada's opportunity to be that supplier of choice, I think, is right in front of us. Over the last couple of years, we've got a few setbacks. The cancellation of Keystone XL is certainly something that is problematic, but we see the Trans Mountain continuing under construction. We see the natural gas LNG project on the West Coast that Shell is leading, continuing. I think that we've already seen prices come back into the $60 a barrel and $3 for natural gas a gigajoule. That as the months and years ahead, I think there's lots of opportunity, and it's going to take a very thoughtful and deliberate approach from many parties, including multiple governments, to allow us to play that role. But no, I think that everybody is more focused today on the economic issues that are important than maybe they were a few years ago, and that is absolutely essential. We keep the eye on the most important issues today, and probably for several years to come.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Alla. So in terms of positive, it is difficult in the state that we're in right now to perhaps see the good things that will come out. I will say, echo Tim's comment about, the sense of unity that the Canadian public has come together. Certainly last spring, faced with an unprecedented global pandemic and having to do the things that we've done as individuals and as organizations to help navigate through what's been an incredibly challenging time. And so that's been, reassuring, I think, to see everyone share a common goal and maybe put other things aside and focus on that. So that's been positive. I think there will be certainly innovation, other opportunities. We did, like I said, have a bit of a recovery period last summer, and we showed some innovation there. We talked about digital already, but municipalities allowing restaurants and retailers to expand in outdoor places that they hadn't been permitted to do. I think that's a really positive step that is good for guests. It's good for those restaurants, and it helps keep businesses afloat and jobs associated with those restaurants and all the supply chain protected. And so I think we will see an opportunity, if we can seize it, to support these businesses in new and innovative ways, and to help them grow, and at the same time look at ways that we can reduce some of the costs to allow these businesses to dig out of the mounds of debt. The comment earlier about borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today is absolutely real. People are snowplowing debt, and so if we can allow both revenue recovery, but also look at ways like taxation that directly impact the operating costs of these small businesses, and particularly restaurants, that would be really welcome, and that will allow more businesses to remain open, employers to stay hiring staff, and to help us climb back out to something, as I described earlier, that is a load-bearing pillar, both economically and culturally in the lives of Canadians. So that'll be the positive if we can get back there.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. I think I'll try to tackle this from two different perspectives, one internal at Air Canada and one external. Certainly from an internal perspective, we're taking the opportunity to see how we can improve our business model, how we can improve our customer go-to-market strategies. What risks can we take to explore different ways of doing business? How can we develop new businesses as we go forward, leveraging some of the key strengths we have as a company? And so I think that from an internal perspective, the ability to sit back and explore and take some risks in a period of almost hibernation is an interesting way to improve the long-term competitiveness of the company. From an external perspective, and that many of the panelists have talked about, including Deborah, working closer with the government, strengthening the relationship between corporate Canada and the government to solve this problem I think is a good starting point to a stronger relationship on a go-forward basis. I know corporate Canada, I know Air Canada is ready, willing, and able to help with whatever we can help in solving this issue, whether that's transporting necessary materials like we have in the past, or having our staff who are trained in medical procedures administer the vaccine. We will do whatever we can, and I know many companies are standing beside us to help solve this problem. So the fact that we can work collectively as a country to resolve this issue as soon as possible, I think is a strong testament to future relationships.
Thank you. And Deborah?
Great remarks. Let no crisis go to waste. Under that premise, I believe that Canada has really shined in the world and showing how it cares about its people, through the pandemic and other events that have transpired that we've all been paying attention to. Commitment to equity and equality has shown, and I think it makes Canada such an attractive country. The number of people that I know that wanted to come and somehow figure out how to be here with me was exponential over the course of this past year, as you can imagine. In terms of opportunities, I think this is, for all industries and certainly for aviation, this is the time to build back better. And we have an opportunity to undo some of those legacy challenges that plagued your air travel that we inherited and had to put in place post 9/11. There's so much innovation, digital capability here in Canada, and also being developed across the sector. This is how we should emerge from this with a totally transformed air experience for our passengers and for our workers as well that are involved in the industry. Second, I still, believe very strongly that this is the time and the moment for us to propel Canada forward by using digital permissions based on testing, based on vaccine, to propel not just travel, but the ability to interact and access other parts of business and society. This is our moment to do that and to stand up and stand as leaders in this part of the recovery from the pandemic.
Thank you. On behalf of the Canadian Chamber, I just want to thank you, Tim, Jordan, Michael, and Deborah for taking the time to speak with us today. Just based on the audience questions that we had coming in, we weren't able to get to all of them, but clearly we could have had an hour-long panel discussion on each one of your respective sectors. But thank you for all the hard work that you've been doing for your employees and for the Canadian economy during this time.